The announcement in December by Japan that it is to restart commercial whaling was met with disappointment by conservationists worldwide. This retrograde step was not unexpected, as in September 2018, Japan tried to get the International Whaling Commission, the IWC, to allow commercial catch quotas, but this was denied. Whaling commenced on the 1st of July, with 5 whaling boats setting sail in the morning and came home that afternoon with 2 grey minke whales. There is a lot of history leading up to this point, which I will try to explain. Firstly, what is the IWC? It is the global body charged with the conservation of whales and the management of whaling. It was set up in 1946, and its mission was to provide for the proper conservation of whale stocks and thus make possible the orderly development of the whaling industry. It also does many other amazing and worthwhile activities, such as having developed a plan for responsible whale watching and carries out study and research on cetacean populations. The IWC now has 98 member nations, and there is a really cool map on their website. Basically, any country in grey is not a member. Whaling has been part of some cultures, including Japanese, for many years, and this is what I love about this kind of research and the amazing resource that the internet is. You can find out so many interesting things, and what I came across was a scientific paper in Nature Communications which has the intriguing title DNA Evidence of Bowhead Whale Exploitation by Greenlandic Paleo-Inuit 4,000 years ago. It is just amazing that scientists were able to use DNA evidence, whereas previous knowledge of these extinct cultures was based primarily on preserved fossils. As whales are pretty big mammals, there are few bones found at these settlements. The blubber and meat would have been harvested where the whale was brought ashore and then transported to the settlement. The consequence is that the fossil record would have underestimated the importance of whales to these ancient Arctic cultures. The results of this paper showed that bowhead whales were hunted 4,000 years ago, and it is thought that the Japanese may have been doing so even earlier. The first method of whaling was when whales that were passing by were scared by small boats and driven onto shore, where they could then be killed. Nearly every part of the whale was used: meat, skin, and blubber. Baleen was woven into baskets and also used as fishing line. In warmer climates, baleen was also used as roofing materials, and bones were used for tool making. As time went on, whales were hunted from small boats using spears or harpoons, which were made from bone or metal. The earliest modern whalers used sailing ships which launched small boats which hunted and killed the whales. They were then brought back to the ship to be butchered and processed into oil. From the 5th to the 15th century, whaling became popular throughout northern Europe. By the 1700s, the American whaling fleet had hundreds of ships in the South Atlantic, the Pacific, and Indian Oceans. Whaling was a multi-million-dollar industry. By the late 1800s, steamships had cannon-fired harpoons, which meant that the whales could be hunted much more efficiently, and by 1930, whaling fleets were slaughtering 50,000 whales every year. In the early 1900s, a Norwegian, with experience of whaling in the Arctic, set up the first whaling station at Grytviken on South Georgia, which is off the Antarctic Peninsula. This was very lucrative, and the oil and whale products from one whale could fetch £2,500. As a consequence, there was a lot of interest in obtaining whaling licenses, and over time 7 whaling stations were set up. I have had the privilege of visiting 3 of these stations, Grytviken, Stromness and Husvik, and it was extremely interesting walking around them, but also obviously very sad. In the late 1920s, pelagic whaling was introduced in the Antarctic. This was because the whale numbers around South Georgia had declined, and the ships had to travel much further, up to 300 kilometres away, to find their prey. The whales were harpooned with an explosive grenade, filled with air, and then marked with a flag or radios. A ship called a catcher would then tow the carcass to a factory ship or a shore station, where it was then processed. It is estimated that between 1904 and 1965, 175,250 whales were processed at South Georgia shore stations. In the whole of the Antarctic region, some 1,432,000 862 animals were taken between 1904 and 1978. By the 1940s, commonly hunted whale species such as blue whales and sperm whales were near extinction. There was a huge decline of whales in the Antarctic, with a peak being reached in the 1961-62 season, with an estimated 66,000 whales being killed. There were only about 2,300 blue whales left out of an original population of 250,000. In 1961, the WWF was founded, and it, along with other organisations, helped inform the public of the plight of the whales, and various Save the Whale campaigns spread around the world. In spite of the calls to ban whaling, the IWC were not able to ban commercial whaling until 1986. However, Japan continued whaling under a special permit. It was not the only nation to continue whaling. Norway and Iceland also participated. I found a very interesting table listing the various countries and the number of whales that they had caught under the headings of Special Permit, Aboriginal Subsistence, and Commercial Catches taken under objection since the zero catch limits came into force. A little more digging and I found out what those headings actually meant. Aboriginal subsistence whaling is not subject to the moratorium. This takes place in countries where whaling has an important role in the nutritional and cultural life of native peoples. The IWC recognises that this is not the same as commercial whaling, which is carried out for profit. There are 4 countries that carry out Aboriginal subsistence whaling. These are Denmark, Russia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Alaska in the US. Special permit whaling is the name given to scientific whaling. Article 8 of the IWC Convention to Regulate Whaling states that countries are permitted to kill whales for scientific research purposes. The individual country is responsible for setting and regulating these catches, not the IWC. Each time a permit is issued, the IWC needs to be informed, and also any scientific information produced should be presented at least once a year to the Commission. Commercial catches taken under objection since the zero catch limits came into force basically means that a country continues to carry out commercial whaling. There are 3 countries that have carried on this type of whaling: Japan, Norway and Iceland. Japan stopped this type of whaling in 1987, but Norway continues to the present day, with Iceland joining it in 2006. Japan has carried out special permit whaling, otherwise known as scientific whaling, since 1987. This has been carried out in the North Pacific and its own territorial waters, but most tragically in the Southern Ocean whale sanctuary that surrounds the Antarctic continent. So Japan has never given up whaling, but has continued to slaughter whales under the pretext of scientific research. So why has Japan decided to start commercial whaling again? Is there a call from the Japanese people for more whale meat on their plates? From the research that I have done, the answer is no. A street survey was conducted of white-collar workers, and only 33% of these people wanted to eat whale meat, and they were mostly from the older generation that had been brought up on whale meat after the Second World War. This was when other meat was scarce, and at this time there was a shift from whale meat being a regional staple to a nationwide staple. It is important to understand that Japan has had a long association with whaling, with evidence of it dating back to the 7th century. Many whaling villages built whale shrines and worshipped whales as gods. Nothing was wasted from the hunted whale, and a famous Japanese proverb says there is nothing to throw away from a whale except its voice. Various forms of whaling have been practiced over time. Pre-modern whaling included passive whaling, which was the first form of whaling used. This was where dead or injured whales that were drifting in the sea were caught, towed onto land, and then processed. In the 1600s, this had evolved into the use of nets. This entailed driving the slower moving whales, such as humpbacks and right whales, into large nets which were positioned near processing facilities on shore. Once the whale had been slowed down by the nets, a harpoonist threw the harpoon, which was attached to a rope. This method of whaling continued up until the end of the 1800s. All of the whale was used for something. Oil was extracted from the blubber, entrails were used both as food and oil, Bones were crushed and used for fertilizer or oil. The whale's sinew was used for such things as musical instruments, and baleen was used in various crafts such as making of puppets. In the early 1800s, whaling boats from America began to hunt whales in Japanese waters. This decimated populations, and as a consequence there were few whales in inland waters for the Japanese to hunt. In the early 1900s, the Japanese decided to adopt a Norwegian style of hunting. A whaling company was set up, which used catcher boats from Norway and were manned by Norwegian gunners. In 1934, a mothership was brought from Norway, which enabled the first Japanese whaling to take place in the Antarctic. This heralded a turning point in Japanese whaling and the start of modern whaling. So Japan is leaving the IWC. There is nothing we can do to stop it. However, it is still bound by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which encourages countries to cooperate on the conservation of whales. Since it has already ignored the ban on whaling, I'm not sure that it feels bounded by any law of the sea. They are, however, retaining observer status at the IWC, so there will be some level of engagement. One positive is that they have confirmed that it will stop hunting in Antarctic waters and that its commercial whaling will be restricted to its economic zones. Antarctic waters will finally be a safe haven for all whales living there. The Australian government has been a critic of Japan's whaling policies for many years, and they are my heroes at the moment. The Environment Minister Melissa Price and Foreign Minister Maurice Payne said in a recent statement, Australia remains resolutely opposed to all forms of commercial and so-called scientific whaling. Dr. Nick Gales, the director of the Australian Antarctic Division within the Department of the Environment and Energy, is Australia's commission to the IWC. He has expressed concern at Japan's planned return to commercial whaling, as it could pose a major threat to whale populations. Populations are only now starting to recover, and the problems faced by whales now are so much greater than 30 years ago. These include climate change, plastics, fisheries interactions and bycatch, and noise in the oceans. These are all issues I will cover in other videos. Japan has carried out scientific whaling in its coastal waters since 2002. This occurs off the Boso Peninsula east of Tokyo, off the northeast coast of the mainland of Honshu and around Hokkaido. From these waters, Beard's peaked whales, Risso's dolphins and pilot whales are hunted. This whaling has been heavily subsidised by taxpayers' money, and although some of the meat is sold, as I mentioned earlier, many Japanese people no longer eat whale meat. According to government data, the country ate more than 233,000 tonnes of whale meat in 1962, but only 3,000 tonnes in 2016, even at a heavily subsidised price. In local markets, whale meat costs less than tuna. And the government holds several thousand tonnes of whale meat in cold storage at significant expense. So I don't really understand why the Japanese government want to start commercial whaling again. It doesn't seem to make any financial sense. However, there are some people who think it is commercially viable, and it seems that this is the only motivating force. Bizarrely, Japan does have a tourist trade in whale watching. This started in 1988 in the Okawasara Islands in the far south of Japan. Since then, other whale watching communities have developed, from the northernmost community in Hokkaido Island, where minke and killer whales, Pacific white-sided dolphins and Dar's porpoises can be seen, to the Zamami Island in the Okinawa Prefecture. Here you can also find overwintering humpback whales where they give birth and raise their calves before heading back to northern waters near Alaska to feed. I am sure that someone will be looking scientifically at the long-term effects on population size of Japan resuming commercial whaling. My concern is that with all the other environmental pressures these beautiful creatures face, we may be in danger of driving some species to extinction. I'm sure that many of you, like me, are greatly saddened that in this day and age, such a barbaric practice continues at all. These are intelligent mammals, and they suffer a great deal when harpooned, taking up to 25 minutes to die. Surely it would be so much better to develop the whale watching industry, particularly for the non-Japanese tourists, than to heavily subsidise an outmoded industry to satisfy the palate of so few people.